Liam felt the silence in the dining room the way a diver feels the pressure of the deep. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the unspoken contempt of his wife's family. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was like the ticking of a clock, counting down the moments to the next casual insult, the next dismissive glance. For 10 years this had been his life, a slow motion drowning in a sea of quiet condescension. He sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, a ghost at a feast he had helped pay for. His wife, Fiona, sat near the head, her posture ramrod straight, a perfect portrait of detached elegance. Her laughter, when it came, was a brittle, tinkling sound reserved for her brother Marcus, who was regaling them with a story about a yacht party. At the head of the table, presiding over the meal like a queen on a gilded throne, was Eleanor, his mother-in-law. Her eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, would occasionally flick toward Liam, a silent judgment in every glance. She saw him not as a son-in-law, but as a stain on the pristine fabric of her family's legacy. He was a man who worked with his hands, a man who drove a simple delivery truck, a man who possessed none of the cutthroat ambition she prized above all else. "The deal with Sterling Price is practically a formality," Marcus was saying, waving his fork for emphasis. "They need our capital and we need their distribution network. It's a perfect synergy." "As long as their board doesn't get spooked," Eleanor said, her voice a low, authoritative purr. "Appearances are everything, Marcus. We must project an image of unassailable success. Every detail matters." Her eyes found Liam's again, and the implication was clear. He was a detail that was out of place. Liam kept his gaze fixed on his plate, methodically cutting his steak into small, precise pieces. He had learned long ago that engaging was a losing battle. His opinions were not welcome here. His presence was merely tolerated, a marital obligation Fiona seemed to find increasingly burdensome. He had given up his own dreams of opening a small woodworking shop to support her career at Prestige Holdings, the family's sprawling investment firm. He had taken on odd jobs with flexible hours so she could climb the corporate ladder, a sacrifice she now framed as a lack of ambition. The conversation drifted, as it always did, to money, status, and the intricate social chess of their world. Liam was an outsider, a spectator to their lives. He felt a familiar pang of loneliness, a quiet ache that had become a permanent resident in his chest. He loved Fiona, or at least he loved the memory of the woman he had married. The woman who had once admired his quiet strength and gentle nature had been slowly replaced by a reflection of her mother, cold and obsessed with the hollow gleam of social standing. After the dessert plates were cleared, Eleanor tapped her crystal water glass with a manicured fingernail. The sharp ping cut through the low hum of conversation. "Now," she began, her voice taking on a tone of magnanimous charity, "we have a small family matter to discuss." Marcus smirked, leaning back in his chair. Fiona looked down at her hands, a faint blush of what might have been shame, or perhaps just annoyance, colouring her cheeks. Liam felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew this tone. It was the tone Eleanor used before delivering a particularly cruel, backhanded compliment or a thinly veiled criticism. "Liam," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we've been worried about you. That delivery job, it's simply not befitting a man connected to this family." "I'm fine, Eleanor," Liam said quietly, his voice even. "It pays the bills." "Bills, yes," Marcus scoffed. "But what about dignity? What about contributing to the family name rather than sullying it?" Fiona shot her brother a weak glare, but said nothing to defend her husband. Her silence was a betrayal that stung more than any insult. "Precisely," Eleanor continued, ignoring Liam's response, "which is why we have come up with a solution. A way for you to be useful, to be part of the prestige holdings world in a capacity you can handle. She paused for dramatic effect, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Liam waited, the silence stretching like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. He could feel their eyes on him, a collective weight of pity and disdain. "We are offering you a position," Eleanor announced. "We need a new family driver. The last one was simply not discreet enough. You, on the other hand, are nothing if not discreet." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A driver. They were offering him a job as their servant. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command disguised as a favor. It was a public declaration of his place in their world, at the bottom, in the driver's seat, waiting to take them to their important lives while he had none of his own. Marcus chuckled. "Think of it, Liam, a real, stable job, a uniform. You'll get to drive the Bentley. It's more than you make in a month just for opening a few doors and keeping your mouth shut." The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. He looked at Fiona, pleading with his eyes for her to say something, to stop this. She met his gaze for a fleeting second, then looked away, her expression unreadable. She would not save him. "It's a very generous offer," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "We just want what's best." Liam felt something inside him shift, a quiet tectonic movement deep within his soul. The years of patient endurance, of swallowing his pride, of hoping for a love that had long since faded, it all began to crack. He didn't rage, he didn't shout. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. The quiet in his tone seemed to unsettle them more than an outburst would have. Later that night, as he lay in the guest room, his new permanent bedroom after a fight months ago, he stared at the ceiling. The offer echoed in his mind, not as an insult anymore, but as a catalyst. The sleeping giant, the patient victim, was beginning to stir. On the nightstand next to a glass of water sat a thick, cream-colored envelope. It had arrived that morning, bearing the letterhead of a prestigious law firm he had never heard of, Blackwood and Finch. He had glanced at it briefly, assuming it was junk mail, some kind of inheritance scam, but now, in the cold, quiet darkness, it seemed to call to him. It was a mystery seed, a loose thread in the tightly woven tapestry of his life. He reached over and picked it up, his fingers tracing the embossed logo. The humiliation of the evening had given him a strange sense of clarity. He had nothing left to lose. He decided he would open it in the morning. The history of Liam's suffering was a novel written in small, painful chapters. When he first met Fiona, she was different. She had been drawn to his stability, his quiet confidence, and the skill he had in his hands. He was a craftsman, a man who could turn a block of wood into a piece of art. She had claimed to love that he was grounded, a stark contrast to the grasping, superficial world she came from. They married against her family's wishes. Eleanor had made her disapproval painfully clear from the start, seeing Liam as a commoner infiltrating her dynasty. He had tried to win them over. He put his dream of opening a woodworking business on hold, a dream he had saved for since he was a teenager. Instead, he took a series of jobs, warehouse manager, delivery driver, handyman, that offered the flexibility Fiona needed to dedicate herself to climbing the ladder at Prestige Holdings. He never complained. He absorbed the subtle digs, the forgotten invitations, the way they spoke about him when they thought he wasn't listening. He did it for Fiona, believing their love was a fortress that could withstand the siege. But he slowly realized he was defending the fortress alone. Fiona, once his ally, had gradually defected to the other side. She started adopting her mother's vocabulary, her mother's values. His simple job became an embarrassment. His calloused hands, which she once held with affection, were now something she seemed to want to hide from her polished friends. The family's cruelty escalated over time, becoming more overt. They saw his patience not as a virtue, but as a weakness to be exploited. They were convinced of their own impunity, certain that he was trapped by his love for Fiona and his lack of financial resources. They believed he would simply endure anything they threw at him, because from their lofty perch they couldn't imagine he had any other choice. Eleanor and Marcus ran Prestige Holdings with an iron fist and a mountain of debt. Their worldview was simple. Wealth was a measure of worth, and status was a weapon. They saw business not as a means of creation, but as a game of dominance. They believed themselves to be untouchable, the rightful heirs to a financial empire they thought their father had built through sheer genius. In reality, the company was a house of cards, propped up by risky loans and aggressive accounting. They were perpetually chasing the next big deal, the next infusion of cash that would keep the facade from crumbling. Their contempt for Liam was, in part, a projection of their own insecurity. They needed to believe he was worthless to reinforce their own fragile sense of superiority. The morning after the disastrous dinner, Liam sat at the small desk in the guest room, the envelope from Blackwood and Finch in his hands. The first letter had been polite, a simple request to contact them at his earliest convenience regarding the estate of his late maternal grandfather, Alistair Finch. This second one, which had arrived yesterday, and he'd left unopened until now, was more urgent. He slit it open. The language was formal, dense with legal terminology, but the message was clear. It was imperative that he schedule a meeting. The matter concerned the final disposition of Alistair's primary assets. Liam barely remembered his grandfather. He was a reclusive, eccentric man who had a falling out with Liam's mother long before Liam was born. They had met only a handful of times at dreary holiday gatherings where Alistair sat in a corner, silent and observant. He had passed away 6 months ago, and Liam had assumed his modest estate had been settled. Curiosity, now tinged with a flicker of defiance, spurred him to act. He looked up the number for the law firm. He felt a strange sense of detachment as he dialed, as if he were watching someone else take control of his life. He scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon, telling the receptionist it was a matter of utmost privacy. He told no one, least of all Fiona. It was the first secret he had kept from her in a very long time, and it felt like a small, private rebellion. Meanwhile, his family's overconfidence was reaching its peak. They took his quiet consideration of the driver job as acceptance. That evening, Fiona approached him, not with an apology, but with a list of duties. "Mother needs to be at the club by 10 for her board luncheon," she said, her tone crisp and businesslike. "And Marcus has a meeting with the Sterling Price people at 2. You'll need to have the Bentley cleaned and ready by 9. She was already treating him like an employee. She didn't even ask if he had made a decision. It was assumed, to make matters worse, her new lover, a slick executive named Julian, had joined them for dinner. He was everything Liam was not, polished, arrogant, and fluent in the language of corporate warfare. He and Marcus spent the evening talking about restructuring and downsizing, while Julian occasionally sent a smug, pitying look in Liam's direction. Fiona, caught in the glow of Julian's ambition, seemed to barely notice her husband was in the room. They were so sure of his weakness, so convinced of their power, that they didn't even see the need for subtlety anymore. They were flaunting their cruelty, certain he was too beaten down to ever fight back. The journey to the law office felt surreal. Liam drove his old reliable pickup truck through the gleaming canyons of the financial district, a world of steel and glass that had always felt alien to him. He parked in a garage that cost more per hour than he made in half a day, and walked toward a skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds. Blackwood and Finch occupied the top 3 floors. The reception area was a cathedral of wealth, with marble floors, dark wood panelling, and a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. A polite but firm receptionist directed him to a corner office with a panoramic view of the city. Mr. Thompson stood to greet him. He was an older man with kind eyes and a reassuringly calm demeanor. He was the quintessential ally, the competent facilitator who would guide Liam through the labyrinth. "Mr. Miller," he said, shaking Liam's hand. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Liam sat in a leather chair that was softer than his own bed. He felt small and out of place, a simple man in a king's court. "I'll get straight to the point," Mr. Thompson began, opening a thick file on his desk. "This is about your grandfather, Alistair Finch." Liam nodded. "I didn't know him well. I assume he left me a small keepsake or perhaps an old savings bond." Mr. Thompson allowed himself a small, wry smile. "You could say that. Alistair was a unique individual. He was intensely private. He built a significant fortune, but he despised the culture of wealth. He lived modestly and kept his affairs meticulously hidden from public view and from his own family, with whom he had a rather strained relationship." The lawyer paused, letting the words sink in. "Mr. Miller, what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to process. Your grandfather was the founder and sole owner of a number of companies. He structured his ownership through a series of interlocking trusts and shell corporations, all managed by this firm. His masterpiece, his largest and most successful creation, was a company he started under a pseudonym decades ago." Mr. Thompson slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. On it was a company logo Liam had seen 1,000 times, on Fiona's briefcase, on the building where she worked, on the letterhead of the documents that governed their lives. It was the logo for Prestige Holdings. Liam stared at it, his mind refusing to connect the dots. "I don't understand. That's my wife's family's company." "That is a common misconception," Mr. Thompson said gently. "Eleanor's father was a man your grandfather hired to be the public face of the company, its first CEO. When he passed away, Alistair allowed Eleanor to assume the role. He let them believe they had inherited the company. In truth, they inherited only management positions. They were, for all intents and purposes, employees. Very well compensated employees, but employees nonetheless. The revelation was a thunderclap in the silent room. Liam felt the floor drop out from under him. His entire reality was tilting on its axis. "Alistair created an ironclad trust," the lawyer continued, his voice steady and calm. "He was the sole beneficiary. The trust holds 95% of the voting shares of the parent corporation that owns Prestige Holdings. Eleanor and her family own the other 5%, a minority stake that gives them no real control. They were never made aware of this structure. They believe their 5% is the controlling interest." Mr. Thompson leaned forward. "Upon his death, the terms of the trust were explicit. His entire estate, including his controlling interest in the trust, passes to his only living direct descendant, you, Liam." Liam couldn't speak. The air had been punched from his lungs. He was the owner, the silent, invisible landlord of his own personal hell. Every insult, every condescending remark from Eleanor and Marcus, every moment of Fiona's cold indifference, it had all been at the expense of the man who owned their entire world. The irony was so staggering, so crushingly perfect, that he almost laughed. Their wealth, their status, their Bentley, the very roof over their heads, it was all his. Their power was an illusion, a stage play, and he had just been handed the script, the director's chair, and the power to bring the curtain down. Mr. Thompson explained the full mechanism of the power. He showed Liam diagrams of the corporate structure, a dizzying web of holding companies designed for one purpose: absolute, anonymous control. He explained that as the new beneficiary of the trust, Liam had the authority to do whatever he wished. He could dissolve the board, fire the CEO, liquidate the assets. He held all the cards. Liam sat back in the chair, the leather creaking like an old church door. He thought of the offer. The driver's job, the uniform, the look on Eleanor's face as she had laid out his new, pathetic future. A cold, clear resolve settled over him. The patient victim was gone, erased by the devastating truth. In his place sat a man who had been handed a sword. He looked at Mr. Thompson, his eyes clear and hard. "They have an emergency board meeting in 2 weeks to finalize the Sterling Price merger," Liam said, the words coming out with a newfound authority. "They believe it will save the company." "It will," Mr. Thompson confirmed. "But it will also expose them to immense personal liability if the company's finances are not what they seem." "Good," Liam said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Before that meeting, I want you to initiate a full, top-to-bottom forensic audit of Prestige Holdings. No notice. I want every expense report, every contract, every executive bonus scrutinized. I want you to act on behalf of the anonymous majority shareholder. Let them feel the pressure. Let them wonder who is pulling the strings." This was the decision point. He was no longer just enduring, he was acting. He picked up a pen from the desk, its weight feeling solid and real in his hand. He signed the documents that officially transferred control of the Alastair Finch Trust to him. Each stroke of the pen was a nail in the coffin of his old life. He and Mr. Thompson spent the next 2 hours in a strategy session. The plan was not simply to fire his wife's family. That was too simple, too quick. The plan was to dismantle their world brick by brick, using their own arrogance and corruption as the tools of demolition. They would let Eleanor and Marcus believe the audit was a hostile move by a competing firm or a disgruntled minority investor. They would use the legal system, the company's own bylaws, and the full weight of corporate governance to surgically expose their incompetence and fraud. And Liam would play his part. He would accept the job as their driver. He would be their chauffeur on the road to their own destruction, a front-row observer to the collapse he was engineering. The thought sent a chill of vindictive pleasure down his spine. It was a cruel plan, a cold plan, but it felt like justice. The next morning, Liam walked into the kitchen where Eleanor and Fiona were having breakfast. He was holding the crisp, new chauffeur's cap in his hands. "I've thought about your offer," he said, his voice humble, his eyes downcast. "I'll take the job." Eleanor smiled, a triumphant, condescending smirk. "Excellent decision, Liam. It's good to see you finally know your place." The first domino was a single, terse email. It arrived in Eleanor's inbox at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, sent from the office of Blackwood and Finch. It was a formal notice informing the board of directors of Prestige Holdings that the majority shareholder had invoked their right to an immediate and comprehensive forensic audit of the company's finances. All books, records, and electronic communications were to be made available to the auditing team, which would be arriving in 1 hour. Eleanor read it twice, her expression shifting from confusion to outrage. "Who do they think they are?" she snapped to Marcus, who had been summoned to her office. "Majority shareholder? We are the majority shareholders." Marcus laughed it off. "It's a scare tactic, Mother. Probably from Sterling Price, trying to knock a few million off the merger price, or one of those pesky activist investors with a single share and a loud mouth. We'll have our legal team bury them in paperwork." But their legal team was powerless. Mr. Thompson had anticipated their every move. The trust's authority was absolute, embedded in the very articles of incorporation they had never bothered to read closely. When they tried to block the auditors, they were met with a crisp legal letter reminding them of their fiduciary duty to comply and the severe legal penalties for obstruction. The reaction phase began. Disbelief curdled into panic. The auditors, a team of stone-faced professionals hired by Liam's firm, descended upon the executive floor. They were polite, methodical, and utterly implacable. They requested access to everything: expense accounts, corporate credit card statements, vendor contracts, private emails on the company server. Eleanor and Marcus tried to put on a brave face, assuring their staff it was a routine procedure. But behind closed doors they were frantic. They knew their books were a work of creative fiction. For years they had treated the company coffers as their personal piggy bank. Lavish vacations were disguised as business trips. Personal shopping sprees were logged as client entertainment. No-show jobs were given to friends of the family. Liam, in his new role, watched the collapse from the best seat in the house. He drove them to hushed, angry meetings with their lawyers. He sat in the gleaming Bentley outside expensive restaurants where they held panicked lunches, his chauffeur's cap pulled low. He listened to their furious, whispered phone calls, their voices tight with fear. "They're looking at the catering bills for the summer gala," he heard Marcus hiss into his phone one afternoon. "The one we billed for 500 guests when only 200 showed up. Where did that money go, Julian?" Liam maintained his facade of quiet servitude. He opened their doors. He greeted them with a deferential "ma'am" and "sir." He offered them bottled water. His meek presence enraged them further. He was a constant, visible reminder of the lower class they so despised, even as their own gilded world was beginning to rust. They lashed out at him for driving too slowly, for taking a wrong turn, for the temperature of the car. Each insult was a drop of fuel on the fire of his cold resolve. The cascade effect began. The auditors' initial findings were devastating. They uncovered a systematic pattern of fraud and embezzlement. A freeze was placed on all executive credit cards and expense accounts. Eleanor was forced to use her own personal card to pay for a lunch, an indignity that left her speechless with fury. Then the next domino fell. The 8-figure loan they were counting on to provide leverage in the Sterling Price merger was abruptly put on hold. The bank, having received a discreet anonymous tip about the audit from Mr. Thompson's office, cited concerns about financial irregularities. Without that loan, their negotiating position was crippled. Worse, the auditors uncovered the kickback scheme between Marcus and Julian. Julian, Fiona's lover, had been approving wildly inflated invoices from a shell company owned by Marcus, with the two of them splitting the profits. When the evidence, a clear paper trail of emails and wire transfers, was presented, Julian was immediately suspended. Fiona was a wreck. She came home that evening, her face pale and drawn. She found Liam in the garage, polishing the hood of the Bentley. "Julian was suspended," she said, her voice trembling. "They're accusing him of fraud. It's a lie. It's some kind of corporate sabotage." Liam looked up from his work, his expression a perfect mask of mild concern. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said softly. "Is there anything I can do?" His sympathy, so false and yet so convincing, seemed to break her. "Do!" she spat, her voice thick with venom. "What could you possibly do? You polish cars. This is a world you can't even begin to understand. My life is falling apart, and my husband is in the garage, playing servant." She stormed into the house, leaving Liam alone in the quiet garage. He stopped polishing and stared at his reflection in the deep, black paint of the car. He saw a stranger looking back at him, a man of chilling patience and methodical vengeance. He felt no remorse. They had sown the wind for a decade, now they would reap the whirlwind. The social ruin came next. News of the audit and the suspension leaked to the financial press. The headline was brutal: Prestige Holdings under investigation amid merger talks. Their carefully curated image was shattered overnight. Friends stopped returning their calls. Invitations to galas and charity balls mysteriously vanished. They were becoming pariahs in the very world they had fought so desperately to conquer. Liam drove them to one last society event they managed to attend. It was a disaster. People spoke to them in hushed tones before making quick excuses to walk away. Whispers followed them through the ballroom like a trail of smoke. Eleanor's face was a mask of strained composure, but Liam could see the terror in her eyes. On the drive home, no one spoke a word. The silence in the car was no longer one of contempt for him, but of shared, suffocating dread. They were trapped in their crumbling world, and the man they had mocked as their driver was the silent, unseen architect of their ruin. The day of the emergency board meeting arrived. The atmosphere in the house was funereal. Eleanor, Marcus, and Fiona were dressed in somber, expensive business attire, like soldiers preparing for a battle they knew they were going to lose. They had been summoned to the main conference room at Prestige Holdings to meet with the legal representatives of the mysterious majority shareholder. They still had no idea who it was. Their best guess was a rival corporation executing a hostile takeover. Liam drove them to the office tower. He pulled up to the grand entrance, the same one he had walked through just 2 weeks ago for his meeting with Mr. Thompson. He got out and opened the door for Eleanor, his movements practiced and smooth. "Wait here," she commanded, her voice brittle. "This won't take long." "Yes, ma'am," Liam said, tipping his cap. He watched them walk through the revolving doors, 3 figures marching toward their own execution. He waited for 5 minutes, then took off his chauffeur's cap and jacket, placing them neatly on the front seat. Underneath, he was wearing a perfectly tailored dark grey suit. From the glove compartment, he retrieved a slim leather briefcase. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and followed them into the building. He walked past the reception desk, giving the stunned receptionist a polite nod, and took the private elevator to the executive floor. The hallway was silent. He could hear raised voices coming from behind the heavy oak doors of the conference room. He paused outside, listening for a moment. It was Marcus's voice, loud and belligerent. "This is an outrage. We demand to know who you represent." Liam pushed the door open and walked in. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him. Eleanor, Marcus, and Fiona were on one side of the long table. On the other sat Mr. Thompson and 2 of his associates. Everyone stared at Liam, their expressions a mixture of shock and utter confusion. "Liam, what are you doing in here?" Fiona asked, her voice sharp with annoyance. "Get out! This is a private meeting." "The help is not allowed in here," Marcus sneered, recovering from his initial shock. "Security!" Liam ignored them. He walked calmly to the head of the table and stood next to Mr. Thompson, placing his briefcase on the polished surface. He looked directly at Eleanor, his gaze steady and unwavering. "There's been a misunderstanding," Liam said, his voice calm and clear, resonating with an authority they had never heard from him before. "I'm not here to call security. I'm here because this meeting is about me." He let the statement hang in the air. He watched the confusion on their faces deepen, the first seeds of a terrible understanding beginning to sprout. "You spent 10 years treating me like I was nothing," he began, his voice low, but carrying to every corner of the room. "You mocked my job, you dismissed my opinions, You did everything in your power to make me feel small. 2 weeks ago, in your own home, you offered me a job as your driver, a final, perfect humiliation to cement my place beneath you." He paused, his eyes sweeping over each of them. Fiona, her face ashen. Marcus, his mouth hanging slightly open. Eleanor, her eyes narrowed in a look of dangerous disbelief. "But what you didn't know," Liam continued, the words hitting them like physical blows, "is that you were offering me a job to drive a car that I owned, to bring you to a building that I owned, to attend a meeting for a company that, as of 6 months ago, I owned." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum where all sound and reason had ceased to exist. Then Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "You're insane, delusional. This is some pathetic fantasy you've cooked up. Thompson, what is the meaning of this? Remove him." Mr. Thompson didn't move. He simply slid a file toward the center of the table. "This is the last will and testament of Alastair Finch, the founder and true owner of the parent corporation of Prestige Holdings. And these," he added, tapping a second file, "are the trust documents, legally transferring sole beneficiary status and all controlling shares to his grandson and only living heir, Liam Miller." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. She looked from the documents to Liam, her mind furiously trying to process the impossible truth. Liam's monologue continued, cold and precise. He laid out everything. "The audit you've been fighting for 2 weeks, I ordered it. The loan that was denied, I made the call. The suspension of your lover, Fiona, that was based on evidence my auditors found of him and Marcus embezzling millions of dollars from my company." Fiona let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at Liam as if seeing him for the first time. The quiet, simple man she had dismissed was a stranger, a mastermind, who had been moving pieces on a board she didn't even know existed. The breakdown was immediate and spectacular. Marcus, his face purple with rage, lunged across the table toward Liam. "You lie!" he roared. 2 security guards, whom Liam had stationed outside the door, entered swiftly and restrained him. He struggled, screaming obscenities, his expensive suit twisting around him. Eleanor shot to her feet, her composure finally shattering like glass. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly sound. "This is my company, my father's legacy. You are nothing, a common, worthless parasite." "Your father was an employee, Eleanor," Liam said, his voice cutting through her tirade like a blade. "Just like you. And as of this moment, your employment, along with Marcus's and Fiona's, is terminated. Effective immediately." That was the final blow. Fiona crumpled into her chair, silent tears streaming down her face as the full weight of her betrayal, both to Liam and by Julian, crashed down on her. Eleanor stood frozen, her face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. Liam's final act was delivered with chilling calm. "Security will escort you from the building. You will be allowed to return to the house, which is a corporate asset you will be vacating by the end of the week, to collect your personal belongings. You will have 1 hour." He picked up his briefcase. "Mr. Thompson has a full report from the audit. A copy has already been delivered to the district attorney's office. I believe you can expect to hear from them shortly regarding the charges of fraud and embezzlement." He looked at Fiona one last time, not with anger, but with a profound and empty sadness. He saw the ruins of the woman he had once loved. He turned without another word and walked out of the room, leaving them to the wreckage of the lives they had built on arrogance and cruelty. The sound of Eleanor's final desperate scream was cut off as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The epilogue of their lives was written by the swift and impersonal hand of justice. Eleanor and Marcus, along with Julian, were arrested the following week. The evidence compiled by Liam's auditors was irrefutable. Faced with a mountain of documentation detailing years of systematic fraud, they were tried and convicted. Eleanor, the proud matriarch, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Marcus, for his more direct role in the kickback schemes, received 10. Their fall from grace was a sensational story in the financial papers, a cautionary tale of hubris and greed. Fiona was not charged criminally, but her punishment was, in its own way, just as complete. She was left with nothing. The family name was disgraced, the fortune was gone, and her social circle evaporated overnight. She was a pariah, stripped of the status and wealth that had formed the entirety of her identity. Liam filed for divorce, a quiet and efficient process. He gave her a small, one-time settlement, more than she deserved, but enough that he could close that chapter with a clear conscience. The last he heard, she was living in a small apartment in a distant city, working a modest administrative job, a ghost of the queen she had once pretended to be. Liam, in contrast, embraced his new role with the quiet competence he had always possessed. He did not move into the lavish family mansion or spend his fortune on yachts and private jets. He sold the gaudy estate and most of the luxury cars, including the Bentley. He moved into a comfortable but modest home on a tree-lined street, not far from where he had grown up. His first order of business was to restructure Prestige Holdings. He fired the entire corrupt executive team and promoted hard-working, ethical people from within the company. He changed the name to Finch Legacy Group in honor of his grandfather. Under his leadership, the firm moved away from risky, speculative ventures and focused on stable, long-term investments that created real value and jobs. The company thrived, becoming more profitable and more respected than ever before. But Liam's greatest reward was not financial, it was the rediscovery of himself. With the profits from the company, he established the Alastair Finch Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing scholarships and grants to aspiring artisans, craftsmen, and small business owners, people who, like him, were often overlooked and underestimated by a world obsessed with corporate pedigrees. He finally built his woodworking shop. It was a large, sunlit space behind his new home, filled with the scent of sawdust and varnish. He spent his weekends there, his hands finding solace in the familiar act of creation. He was no longer just a CEO, he was a craftsman again. One afternoon, while visiting a gallery that was showcasing work from one of his foundation's first scholarship recipients, he met a woman named Clara. She was an architect, with a warm smile and eyes that saw him for who he was, not what he owned. She was impressed not by his wealth, but by the story of the foundation and the passion with which he spoke about his woodworking. Their connection was immediate and genuine, built on shared values of integrity and creativity. She loved his calloused hands. A year after the confrontation in the boardroom, Liam stood on a balcony overlooking the bustling trading floor of the Finch Legacy Group. The company was a model of ethical success. His employees respected him not just for his position, but for his fairness and vision. He was at peace, the ghosts of his past finally laid to rest. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Clara with a picture of a ridiculously oversized pumpkin she had bought for them to carve. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He typed back, "I'll pick up dinner. See you at 7. As he walked away from the balcony, leaving the world of high finance behind for the evening, he reflected on the turbulent journey that had brought him here. True power, he realized, lay not in what we display to the world, but in the quiet strength of our character. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or stock prices, but in integrity, purpose, and the ability to build a life of meaning. The arrogant and the cruel may build their empires high, but they build them on foundations of sand, destined to be washed away by the tides of truth and consequence. Liam had found his foundation, not in a boardroom, but in a workshop, in a quiet home, and in the promise of a future built by his own 2 hands.